PS4 and PS5 video. So we've seen a lot of new developments on the PS4 recently and PS5, allowing us to jailbreak higher firmwares. And with the recent release of 12.20 on the PS5 and 13.0 on the PS4, I think it's time to do an updated jailbreak / state of jailbreak video to let you guys know where we stand with jailbreaking the consoles on the different firmwares and what to do depending on what type of console you have. So starting with the PlayStation 4, it's important to note that the type of console does not matter. You can jailbreak a Fat, Slim, or Pro in the same way. What matters is the firmware version that the console is running. So you can find this out by going into the settings, System and System Information. The system software version is your console's firmware version, and depending on what that number is, it will determine what options you have to jailbreak it. All jailbreaks for the PS4 and PS5 are tethered jailbreaks, meaning that you have to load the exploit again after every reboot. So exploits that have a shorter load time are generally preferred. Now, in order to jailbreak the PS4, we typically need to exploits chained together, a kernel exploit and a userland exploit. Now, the kernel exploit is what actually jailbreaks as the kernel is the lowest layer in the operating system. So once you gain control of that, you more or less have control over the whole system. Last year, the highest kernel exploit was known as Pwn and worked up to firmware 11.00, but we now have a new kernel exploit that works up to firmware 12.02, known as the lapse kernel exploit or IO exploit. Asynchronous IO. The problem is that the user is sitting in user space, a higher layer in the operating system, and cannot reach that kernel code to trigger the kernel exploit. So we need what's known as a userland exploit, which is an exploit in an application that the user has access to, which we can use to run custom code on, to trigger a vulnerability within that application, which will allow us to gain deeper access into the system, to reach that kernel code and trigger the kernel exploit. So we need a userland and kernel exploits both chained together, and they both need to be available on the same firmware in order to jailbreak it. So we have a web browser userland exploit called PS3 that works up to firmware 9.60, as the web browser can execute custom JavaScript code. A new Blu-ray exploit that works up to firmware 12.50, as the Blu-ray player needs to be able to load Java code for some interactive Blu-ray features. And we have a save game exploit that works up to firmware 13.02. Currently, still works up to the latest firmwares that are being released, as some games use Lua script for the save files, which can then be replaced with custom Lua script, which is executed when the save file is loaded by the game. And this exploit remains unpatched to this day. So these are our userland exploits, which are then chained with a kernel exploit to jailbreak the PS4. So we're always limited by whatever the lowest firmware is. By either exploit if you're on firmware 9.60 or lower. You can use the web browser to jailbreak, which is by far the easiest option. Just open the web browser and load a web page that's hosting the exploit, like nasty.github.io/PS3, or host the files yourself from the all-azif repo on GitHub. Then press a button and it should jailbreak within a few seconds. Sometimes the jailbreak can fail, in which case just restart the console and try again. Now past 9.60, we have multiple other options for jailbreaking. We have the older pppawn kernel exploit, which works up to 11.00 and can actually be triggered without a userland exploit, but requires another device to send the required network data. That's used to trigger the jailbreak. This exploit isn't used as much since these days. You need to change your network settings to PPPoE, and the exploit can take several minutes to load in the worst of cases. So you can get devices like Luckbox and Raspberry Pis to auto-run the exploit when the console starts up, and even install these devices inside the console as a mod chip in order to auto-load the exploit for you. It's still a useful exploit for those with broken Blu-ray drives, as it's done entirely through the network connection without needing a userland exploit. Now, if you have a working disk drive on the other hand, then by far the best option is to use the Blu-ray exploit BD jailbreak, as it supports firmwares up to 12.50, allowing us to jailbreak up to 12.02 with the lapse kernel exploit. When chained together, all you do is write an ISO image to a blank BD-R or BD-redisk. It does need to be a Blu-ray disc and not a DVD or CD. You can also buy pre-made discs that already have the exploit written to them, so that you don't need a Blu-ray burner for your computer. Simply copy the Gold 10 payload, which is the main jailbreak payload for the PS4, to the root of a USB drive and rename it to payload.bin. Plug it into the PS4 and insert the disk. And it will run the jailbreak and load the payload from the USB. It then transfers the payload from that USB to the internal hard drive. So it will load it from there the next time you want to load the jailbreak again. So the USB drive is no longer required. What makes the Blu-ray exploit is that you can also add more stuff onto the disc. For example, I created an all-in-one ESO, which includes the golden payload on the disc. So it can be loaded from there instead of a USB. And it's also packed with some useful homebrew and other payloads that can be installed directly off the disk, so it allows you to get everything you need directly from the one disk. Now the alternative is the Lua Save Game exploit, which works up to firmware 13.02 or the latest firmware for the PS4 is currently unchained. With the Labs kernel exploit, we can use it to jailbreak up to 12.02. In most cases, you will still need a working disk drive, as you will need to get a physical copy of one of the supported games. That can be used to load the exploit. Now, this could be a little tricky, as the games we need to load the exploit are Japanese games that run the Artemis game engine. And this is the list of currently supported titles. And you can get them outside of Japan from places like Japan and Play Asia that will ship them to your country. But they do tend to be quite expensive, especially with the extra shipping costs. Now, the other downside is that the jailbreak setup is more complicated with this method, as you also need to be able to get the save file installed and resigned to your PS4 account and transferred to the PS4, which is used to load the exploit, which is some extra work that you don't have to deal with when using the Blu-ray exploit. So again, my recommendation is to use the web browser exploit. PS3 up to firmware 9.60. Once you go past 9.60, the Blu-ray exploit, which works up to 12.02, is the best choice in my view. And if you don't have a working disk drive, you can always use the PPPON exploit up to firmware 11.0 through the network connection. So those are my recommendations for the PS4. And if you're on a firmware higher than 12.02, then unfortunately, you need to wait for a new kernel exploit to release to be able to jailbreak those higher firmwares. But now let's go ahead and dive into the PlayStation 5. You can check your firmware version by going into the settings, System Console Information page. And your system software version is in this long string after the first dash. So this console here is on 8.0 as an example. A lot of the same exploits for the PS4 carry over to the PS5. As the jailbreak works in the same way, with a kernel exploit and userland exploit chained together. Now, we have an IPv6 kernel exploit working from firmware 3.0 to 4.51, a UMTX kernel exploit, which works up to 7.61, and the same Labs kernel exploit as the PS4, which works up to 10.0, one on the PS5 now. The userland story is very familiar, with the same PS3 WebKit exploit working up to 5.50. On the PS5, a Blu-ray exploit BD jailbreak working up to 7.61. The same Lua Save Game exploit working up to the latest firmware. Currently last but not least, we have a new userland exploit being developed using the YouTube application, but that one is still work in progress. So if you're on 5.50 you can use the PS3 web browser exploit chained with the UMTX kernel exploit to jailbreak. The PS5 doesn't have a web browser app like the PS4, but you can still access websites through the user guide by adding a custom DNS to your network settings. That will redirect the user guide page to an exploit site instead. You can load the jailbreak and then select a payload like kstuff or ETA, at which point you can then gain access to the debug settings, which can be used to install a web browser shortcut to umtex, to .pages.dev or umtx.pages.dev, which will launch the exploit page whenever you open the browser. Like the PS4, it's by far the easiest and fastest way to jailbreak. Once you have the web browser shortcut set up, the downside is it only works on firmwares on 5.50 or older. Next up, we have the Blu-ray exploit BD jailbreak, which is also chained with the UMTX kernel exploit, allowing you to jailbreak up to 7.61 firmware. Just like the PS4, we burn an ESO to a Blu-ray disc and load it up on the console. Then we can use the pipeline runner to execute the full exploit chain. That will result in loading the jailbreak and auto-closing the displayer. Once it's finished again, we have the Lua Save exploit, which can be chained with the Labs kernel exploit to jailbreak up to 10.0.01. Same situation as PS4, where you need to get a physical copy of one of the Japanese games to get the modified save file installed on the console, which can be done with a backup file. We simply copy the Lua loader folder to the root of a USB and add the ETA hen payload inside ETA, hen being the main jailbreak payload for the PS5 right now, like gold hen was for PS4. The autorune.txt file is then edited to include the payload, and then the USB can be connected to the PS5. Now, loading the game will trigger the exploits from the modded save file, which will then load the jailbreak and execute the payload on the USB drive to jailbreak the payload console. Can later be moved to the hard drive so that it does not require the USB drive in future attempts to load the jailbreak. So finally, we have the YouTube exploit Y2JB, which is still currently in development. Once complete, we could chain it with the lab's kernel exploit to jailbreak the 5 up to firmware 10.01, which would be the best option, as it will work on digital edition consoles and does not require purchasing expensive games or a Blu-ray burner. Now, you also might be wondering if we can also use this on the PS4 exploit, and why it's not included on the PS4 section. Well, technically, it could be used on the PS4, but the PS4 version of YouTube and other media applications require the app to be licensed on your account. So you need to have a valid license. So you have to have purchased the YouTube or essentially downloaded it from PSN. So it's linked to your account, and if you don't already have a working version of the YouTube application installed and licensed on your account, then you cannot use it to jailbreak the PS4. The PS5 version of the YouTube and application some other media applications can simply be downloaded and launched on any PS5. They are not locked to a specific account via a license file, which can allow you to install and run older versions on your PS5. So it can be used to jailbreak it. Now when it comes to my recommendations, I think the PS3 web browser exploit up to firmware 5.50 is what I would recommend using. And once you go past 5.50 on higher firmwares above that, then I would wait for the YouTube jailbreak to be complete, and then use that method to jailbreak your PS5, as it's going to be the next most convenient option. Now we have some additional complications with like the PS5 not having many working backports to get newer PS5 games running on older firmwares. So the lower the firmware, the more limited you are in the games that you can actually run. Now, this does not affect the PS4 games, as we already have backports to run the latest PS4 games on older PS5 firmware. So this issue is specific for PS5 games only. We also don't have access to fake packages for PS5 which games, is what's been used to install and play PS4 game backups on jailbroken PS4s and PS5s. We have to load PS5 game backups from the raw game files instead, which creates compatibility issues with many PS5 preventing them from being loaded. So the selection of playable PS5 games on offer is already limited, but the lower the firmware, the more limited that pool of playable games becomes. Now this means that some people might want to update to the latest jailbreakable firmware on their PS5 so that they can access more recent PS5 games and have more PS5 games that they can play overall. But at the same time, we don't really have a full jailbreak on the PS5 either, as the PS5 has a hypervisor, which restricts access to the kernel as an additional security layer, which does not exist on the PS4. So luckily, we do have a workaround for this called KStuff, which is implemented inside of ETA hen. But this workaround is not perfect and does have a slight performance impact on your games, which can cause frame drops and longer loading times. You can disable KStuff once the game is loaded to gain back some extra performance, but lower firmwares are more vulnerable to future exploits and are more likely to get a full hypervisor exploit. That could then be used to gain even more control over the PS5, to be able to do things like load Linux on the console in the future and remove the need for KStuff, so that we'd be able to get the full performance of the console when running our game backups. So the PS5 jailbreakers, I guess, are into different camps. You've got the people waiting on the older firmwares for a full hypervisor for more features, and then you also have the people who just want to update to the latest jailbreakable firmware to play more PS5 game backups because they're happy enough with the way the current jailbreaks are. With KStuff, if you're happy enough with the existing jailbreaks, then I would still wait on your current firmware for the YouTube jailbreak to be complete, so that you can then use YouTube or another media application to jailbreak up to the latest jailbreakable firmware. That's supported by KStuff. KStuff currently supports firmwares up to 9.60. It doesn't have support up to 10.01 yet, So I would only update to 9.60. That's as far as you should go until KStuff supports up to 10.01. Once the YouTube exploit is ready to load the jailbreak. And of course again, if you're on a higher firmware than 10.01, then you'll need to wait for a new kernel exploit to release to be able to jailbreak those higher firmwares. Now another problem we have with the PS5 is that we have models without a disk drive. And the disk drive is required to use the Blu-ray and the Lua-Save exploit now. If you only have a digital edition console or a disc edition slim console that does not have a paired disk drive, then you have less exploits to work with. So you can jailbreak up to 5.50 with the web browser. And once this YouTube userland exploit Y2JB is fully up and running, you should be able to use that to jailbreak up to the latest jailbreakable firmware. So you can still jailbreak with digital-only consoles, but disc edition consoles are always going to be more desirable as they're vulnerable to more exploits. So that's the current state of jailbreaking the PS4 and PS5 at the moment, at the tail end here of 2025. Now, just to add a quick section here about stuff that I didn't cover. Now, I did leave a couple of things out of this video to try and not overcomplicate things. So I'll just give them a little bit of an honorable mention. At the end, there is actually a full hypervisor exploit available for the called PS. Hypervisor, however, it only works on very old PS5 firmware. We're talking 1.x and 2.x firmwares, which are so old that they're pretty irrelevant for most people. But as there's not many people who are still on firmwares that old, that would be able to take advantage of that hypervisor, which is why I haven't really talked about it here in this video until now. And then also there is the Master Core exploit, which is another userland exploit that can be used to load the jailbreak on the PS4 and PS5, which uses a PlayStation to game through a modified save file. But again, that one also does not apply to many people, as you have to have a licensed copy of that specific game. And it's a digital-only game that you would have had to download while your console was on the latest before you took it offline to wait for a jailbreak. So again, for the same reason, I didn't really cover it because it doesn't really affect many people. It's not really that useful for the majority of people looking to jailbreak their consoles. So that's why those things were specifically left out. And there are other kernel vulnerabilities and web browser vulnerabilities that are being looked into to see if we could get jailbreaks on even higher firmwares. You know, ways of jailbreaking through the web browser, which we currently don't have right now. So that stuff is ongoing, but anyway, that's basically it for this video. So hope you guys enjoyed this one or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and as always,